The security guard's hand closed around Grant Sullivan's arm before he finished his sentence. Caroline Whitmore did not blink. She had already turned back to her phone, letting the meeting resume as if nothing had happened. Nobody in that hotel lounge knew they had just thrown out the one investor who could still save the company. Nobody would know for another 6 minutes until an assistant burst through the door out of breath and said a name that drained every color from Caroline's face. Sullivan Capital. 3 hours earlier, none of that had seemed possible. Whitmore Systems occupied 4 floors of a glass tower in Midtown Manhattan, and from her office on the top floor, Caroline could still convince herself the company was simply going through a rough quarter. The truth sat in a folder on her desk that she had stopped opening. 11 weeks of cash remained. After that, payroll would stop, and 3,000 employees would find out on a Friday afternoon that the company their families depended on no longer existed. The crisis had started a year earlier when the company's largest client, a logistics firm that accounted for nearly 40% of annual revenue, moved its contract to a competitor overnight, citing nothing more than a better price. Caroline had built her entire identity on the idea that appearances told the truth about a person. Her father, who founded Whitmore Systems 4 decades earlier, had taught her that a firm handshake, a tailored suit, and a confident voice were the fastest way to read a room. He had died 3 years earlier, leaving her the company along with a board that had spent decades taking his instructions without much debate. Caroline had spent those 3 years proving she deserved the seat, closing 3 major deals in her first year alone, and had started to believe the board's confidence in her judgment was earned rather than inherited. The client that walked away was the first real test of that judgment since her father's death, and by the time Sullivan Capital's name reached her desk, she had convinced herself that trusting her instincts, the same instincts her father had trained into her since childhood, was the only way through it. She had never questioned those instincts, because they had never failed her, not once, not until the year everything else started failing at the same time. For 8 months, her team had chased every investor willing to take a meeting. Most said no within a week. One fund manager had sat through her entire pitch, nodded along at the right moments, then told her flatly that Whitmore Systems felt like a company already on its way out, and that his fund did not invest in companies that were simply delaying the inevitable. Caroline had smiled through that meeting and cried in her car afterward alone in a parking garage, before driving back to the office as if nothing had happened. Sullivan Capital was the last name left on the list, and the one meeting she could not afford to lose. She had prepared for 3 days, rehearsing numbers, rehearsing apologies for numbers that would not add up, rehearsing everything except what the man across the table would actually look like. The meeting had been arranged in a private lounge at a hotel near the Whitmore offices, a room with high windows and small round tables, chosen because it felt less intimidating than a boardroom for a first conversation. A handful of Whitmore executives sat scattered around the room that morning, along with 2 junior associates from Sullivan Capital who had arrived early to confirm logistics and were quietly waiting near the back, close enough to see everything that was about to happen, but not close enough to stop it. Jonathan Pierce, the company's chief operating officer, waited with Caroline near the entrance. He had worked under her for 6 years and rarely spoke unless asked, but he had a habit of noticing things she missed. When a man in a plain gray shirt walked in carrying a small backpack shaped like a dinosaur, Jonathan was the first to stand. Caroline barely looked up from her notes. The man introduced himself as Grant Sullivan. He explained briefly that he had picked his daughter up from an appointment before the meeting and hadn't had time to drop off her backpack, which was why he was still holding it. Jonathan reached out and shook his hand without hesitation, offering to get him coffee. Caroline did not stand. She looked at the plain shirt, the backpack, the absence of anything she recognized as belonging to a man who ran a multi-billion-dollar fund, and she decided, in less than 4 seconds, that he was in the wrong room. "I think there's been a mistake," she said, her voice carrying to the other executives seated nearby. "This meeting is with Sullivan Capital. I'm not sure who let you in, but this isn't a walk-in consultation." A few people laughed, not because it was funny, but because laughing at what a CEO says is easier than staying silent. Grant did not raise his voice. He said his name again slower and told her he had flown in that morning specifically for this meeting. Caroline had heard enough stories about people posing as investors to know how convincing they could sound. She waved toward the door and told security the man needed to be shown out, that Whitmore Systems did not have time for people wasting a scheduled slot meant for someone else. A guard approached and took Grant's arm. He did not resist. He looked at Caroline for a moment, said nothing further, picked up his daughter's backpack from the chair, and walked out through the lobby without looking back. The two associates near the back exchanged a glance, said nothing, and quietly stepped out a side door a few minutes later. Jonathan sat frozen, the coffee he had ordered for Grant still sitting untouched on the table. He opened his mouth once as if to say something, then closed it again, watching Caroline turn back to the room and ask if they could get started without further interruptions. Nobody in that lounge questioned her. Nobody except Jonathan seemed to notice that the man who had just been thrown out hadn't argued, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't done anything a fraud typically does when caught. 6 minutes later, Caroline's assistant came through the door at a near-run phone in hand and said the name that changed everything. Grant Sullivan was not an imposter. He was the founder of Sullivan Capital, the fund that controlled $500 million in active investments and had spent 8 months quietly reviewing Whitmore systems as its last remaining rescue option. The man Caroline had just ordered removed from the building was the only person left who could keep 3,000 employees from losing their jobs. Caroline did not move for several seconds. The room, which had been buzzing with relief moments earlier, went completely silent. She asked her assistant to say it again, as if the words might change on a second telling. They did not. Grant Sullivan. The man in the gray shirt, the man with his daughter's dinosaur backpack, was already gone, and by the time Caroline reached the lobby, his car had pulled away from the curb. She called his office within the hour. The call was declined. She sent an email that afternoon, carefully worded professional apologetic without admitting too much. No response came. By the next morning, the board had convened an emergency call, and one director asked her directly how she had let the company's last chance walk out the door over a shirt, his voice flat enough that it was clear he already knew there was no good answer coming. Caroline had none that satisfied him, because the honest answer was one she was not yet ready to say out loud, even to herself. Over the following 2 days, she tried everything a person in her position could try. She had her assistant call Sullivan Capital's office 7 times. She drafted a longer letter and sent it by courier instead of email, hoping paper would carry more weight than a message that could be deleted in a second. Nothing came back. On the 3rd morning, sitting alone in her office with the 11-week countdown now down to 10 weeks and 4 days, Caroline made the only decision left available to her. She was going to fly to Sullivan Capital herself, uninvited, and find a way to stand in front of Grant Sullivan again. The story did not stay contained for long. By the following week, a financial gossip site ran a piece with a headline suggesting a tech CEO had a billionaire investor thrown out over his shirt, and the article's undertone made clear that his shirt was doing a lot of work to avoid saying what everyone in the comments said outright, that a black man in a hotel lobby got read as suspicious before he ever opened his mouth. Caroline read every comment once, sitting alone in her apartment at midnight, then closed her laptop and did not open the article again. Within days, 3 other investment groups quietly withdrew term sheets that had been on the table for weeks, citing timing and market conditions in polite emails that convinced no one. One prospective investor was more direct on a call with Caroline's assistant, saying plainly that his fund could not be associated with a story like this one, not this year, not with reporters already circling. Word moves fast in a small industry, and the story that spread was never about a missed connection. It was about a chief executive whose judgment could not be trusted, whose instincts revealed something about her that a balance sheet could not fix. An old colleague from business school, someone Caroline had once considered a close friend, canceled a standing lunch that week without much explanation and did not reschedule it. It was a small thing compared to everything else happening that month, but it told her something the news coverage could not. The people closest to her were recalculating what she was worth to know the same way she had once recalculated what Grant was worth to speak to in under 5 seconds, without asking a single question first. During those sleepless weeks, Caroline pulled out a box of her father's old notebooks kept in storage since his death, looking for something that might explain how she had ended up so certain of a mistake so large. She found what she was not expecting. In a notebook from the company's earliest years, her father had written a short line about a supplier. He almost turned away for showing up in work clothes instead of a suit, and how he had caught himself just in time, deciding that judging a person before hearing him out was the fastest way to lose good people and good deals both. Caroline had spent her whole life believing she inherited her instincts from him. She now understood she had only inherited half the lesson. Jonathan Pierce was the only person at Whitmore Systems who still spoke to Caroline the same way he had before the story broke. He brought her coffee most mornings the way he had once tried to bring one to Grant, and never once brought up what had happened in the hotel lounge unless she raised it first. It was Jonathan who eventually suggested she stop waiting for Sullivan Capital to answer emails and go to Boston in person, telling her plainly that a man like Grant Sullivan was not going to be won back by a message he could delete without reading. Caroline began reading everything she could find about Grant Sullivan, searching for a way to understand the man she had misjudged in under 5 seconds. Old interviews described a fund manager who had built Sullivan Capital from nothing, starting with 3 clients and a folding table in a rented office above a laundromat, and who had lost his wife 4 years earlier, raising his daughter largely on his own since. One profile, 3 years old, quoted him saying he showed up to first meetings dressed plainly on purpose, that a person's character showed fastest in how they treated someone who appeared to have nothing to offer. People who had worked with him for years understood it was never an oversight. It was a test, and most people never realized they were taking it until they had already failed. On the 10th day, with the board threatening to replace her within the month, Caroline booked a flight to Boston without telling anyone where she was going. She arrived at the address listed for Sullivan Capital, a converted warehouse near the waterfront with exposed brick and no sign on the door, and told the receptionist she needed 5 minutes with Grant Sullivan, no appointment, and that she understood if he refused to see her. The receptionist did not ask her to leave. She simply picked up the phone, relayed the name, and told Caroline to take a seat. He did not refuse, but he also did not rush. Caroline sat in that lobby for nearly 3 hours, and the longer she sat, the more the room told her something the company's own headquarters never had. There was no marble, no wall of framed magazine covers, no receptionist trained to make visitors feel small until they were announced. Employees walked past in jeans and sneakers, carrying their own coffee, nodding politely at a stranger waiting on the couch instead of ignoring her. It occurred to Caroline, somewhere in the second hour, that Sullivan Capital's plainness was not an act performed for a single meeting. It was simply how the place ran. A young associate finally led her back to a corner office with a view of the harbor. Grant sat behind a plain desk, no different from the one any of his employees might use, papers stacked neatly to one side, and did not stand when she entered. A framed photograph of a young girl in a soccer uniform sat near his monitor, the only personal object visible in the entire room. "I'm not here to ask you to reconsider the investment," Caroline said before he could speak first. "I'm here because I owe you an apology I should have given you in that lobby, and I didn't know how else to give it." Grant listened without it interrupting his expression unreadable, and let a long stretch of silence sit between them before he answered. "You keep saying you didn't know who I was," he said. "That's not the problem. If I'd been some no-name investor with $500 to his name, you still shouldn't have treated me the way you did. The problem was never that you didn't recognize me. The problem is you decided the second you saw me that I didn't deserve 5 minutes of basic respect." Caroline started to answer, then stopped, because nothing she had rehearsed on the flight up matched what he had just said. "I've spent 10 days trying to figure out what to say to you," she admitted. "I keep landing on the same sentence, and it sounds worse every time I say it out loud. I looked at you and decided you didn't belong in that room." Grant nodded once slowly, as if the honesty of that sentence was the first thing she had said all afternoon that he actually believed. He told her he appreciated her saying it plainly instead of dressing it up, but that an apology alone did not answer the only question that mattered to him, which was what happened to the 3,000 people who had nothing to do with the 4 seconds it took her to make up her mind. Grant did not tell her that day whether he would invest. After she left, one of his senior associates asked him directly whether backing Whitmore Systems now would make the fund look like it was rewarding a company for bad behavior once the story quieted down. Grant told him the fund wasn't investing in Caroline, and it never had been. It was investing in 3,000 people who would lose their health insurance and their mortgages over a decision that had nothing to do with any of them. And if the optics of that bothered anyone, they were welcome to explain it to the families involved. He asked Caroline to fly back to New York and wait, and for 6 days she heard nothing, checking her phone every few hours out of habit rather than hope. When his call finally came, it was brief and businesslike, none of the warmth or tension of the Boston office carrying over into his voice. He told her 3,000 people did not deserve to lose their jobs over a decision she had made in 4 seconds, and that he was prepared to move forward, but only under conditions that had nothing to do with financial terms. He wanted her to issue a public apology on record, naming exactly what she had done and why, without softening it into a vague statement about miscommunication. He wanted a full overhaul of Whitmore Systems' internal culture, starting with how the company trained every employee who dealt with outside partners and clients. And he wanted her to step down as chief executive effective once the investment closed, replaced by someone the board would select from within the company. Two smaller conditions followed almost as an afterthought, a portion of her own personal wealth directed toward mentorship programs for young people in underserved communities and full cooperation with whatever restructuring the new leadership decided was necessary. Caroline told Jonathan first before she told the board. He listened to all 5 conditions in her office, standing rather than sitting, and when she finished, he asked her only one question, whether she was actually going to go through with it or whether she was telling him what she thought he wanted to hear. Caroline told him she was going through with it. Jonathan nodded and said it was the first decision he had seen her make in months that sounded like her own, and not like something drafted by a lawyer. Caroline brought the terms to the board the next morning, and the room split immediately. One member argued the conditions were punitive and had nothing to do with sound business judgment, saying a fund should not be allowed to dictate who ran a public company. The board chair pointed out more quietly that no other offer existed and that the company had gone from 11 weeks of cash to just over 8 since the morning Caroline missed the handshake, a number that kept shrinking regardless of how the board felt about the terms. A third member asked whether the board could simply accept the investment and ignore the 4th condition once the money was in the account. Caroline answered that one herself, telling the room that Grant Sullivan would know within a week if they tried, and that breaking the agreement would cost the company far more than her job ever could. She sat through 40 minutes of arguing before finally telling the room there was nothing left to debate. She was going to accept every condition, whether the board approved of the 4th one or not, because the 4th one was the price and there was no version of the deal without it. She said yes to Grant within the day. There was no version of the future where Whitmore Systems survived without the investment, and no version of herself she could live with if she let 3,000 people lose their jobs to protect her own title. The public apology went out the following week, delivered at a press conference. Caroline insisted on holding herself rather than through a written statement her lawyers had drafted for her. The room was smaller than she expected. A handful of reporters and a single camera crew, but the silence when she stepped up to the microphone felt larger than any boardroom she had ever stood in. Standing behind a single microphone, no notes in front of her, she said the words plainly that she had looked at a man's clothing and the color of his skin and decided in under 5 seconds that he did not belong in a room he had every right to be in, and that no title or apology could undo what that decision had already cost the people who trusted her. A reporter near the front asked if she believed the apology would be enough to save her position. Caroline answered that she did not expect it to, and that saving her position had stopped being the point the moment she understood what she had actually done. A second reporter asked whether she blamed the culture of the industry for how quickly the story had escalated. Caroline said no, and that placing the blame anywhere but on her own 4 seconds of judgment would make the apology worthless. Coverage shifted in the days after the press conference. A few columnists who had spent weeks mocking her called the apology unusually direct for a corporate statement, and one op-ed argued that whatever came next for Caroline, personally, the company's employees deserved credit for how quickly the board had moved to make the terms real instead of letting them sit as a press release. None of it changed what came next. The board had already made its decision before the ink on the coverage dried. The board did not wait long after that. Within 72 hours of the apology going public, the board chair called Caroline into a conference room and told her without much preamble that the board had voted to remove her as chief executive effective immediately, with an interim successor to be named within the week. Caroline did not argue. She had known the moment she agreed to Grant's terms that this conversation was coming. And there was a strange relief in finally hearing it said out loud instead of carrying the dread of it alone. She cleared her office over a single weekend alone, carrying out boxes of framed photographs and awards that suddenly felt like they belonged to someone else. Her father's portrait, the one that had hung behind her desk since the day she took over the company, came down last. The woman who had walked into that hotel lounge, certain she could read a person's worth in 4 seconds, now stood in an empty office with nothing left to prove it, having lost the company, the title, and the reputation she had spent her whole life building. The investment closed 2 weeks after Caroline's departure, and Grant Sullivan made no public statement about it beyond a short line confirming Sullivan Capital's involvement. He gave no interviews about the apology, no comment about Caroline personally, and made clear to the new leadership that his decision had never been about rescuing her career. 3,000 employees kept their jobs, and that, as far as Grant was concerned, was the only outcome that mattered enough to talk about. Losing the company meant losing more than a title. Caroline gave up the car service, the corner apartment near the office, the assistant who had managed her calendar for 6 years. She moved into a smaller place across town, took the subway for the first time in over a decade, and spent the first few weeks doing the ordinary tasks she had outsourced for so long that she had almost forgotten how they worked. None of it made the papers. None of it was part of the deal Grant had negotiated. It was simply what was left once the title, the office, and the identity built around both were gone. Caroline began seeing a therapist for the first time in her life that same month, not because anyone required it, but because she needed a place to say things she was not ready to say to Jonathan or to the strangers in her training sessions. Most of their sessions circled back to the same 4 seconds in the hotel lobby, and the therapist eventually pointed out that Caroline kept describing the moment as an aberration, a single mistake, when everything else she said about her upbringing suggested it had been building for years. Caroline did not like hearing that. She stopped arguing with it instead. Caroline spent the following months doing the parts of the agreement no camera was watching. She sat through a diversity and inclusion training session alongside a group of entry-level employees who had no idea who she used to be taking notes like everyone else in the room, while a facilitator half her age walked through case studies that were unmistakably versions of what she had done in that hotel lounge. One case study described a manager who dismissed a job candidate based on his appearance during a 5-minute first impression, and the facilitator asked the room what they thought the manager should have done differently. A young employee near the front said simply that the manager should have asked questions before making assumptions, and Caroline wrote the sentence down like it was the first time she had heard it, because in a way it was. 3 months into the process, a reporter recognized her outside her apartment building and asked with a camera already recording whether the mentorship program was an attempt to buy back her reputation. Caroline stopped, considered the question honestly instead of deflecting it, and told the reporter she didn't expect the program to buy back anything, that some things simply weren't for sale, and that she would still be doing this work whether anyone was filming it or not. The clip ran for a day and was forgotten within a week, which suited her fine. She personally funded, without press releases or public announcements, a mentorship program pairing Whitmore engineers with high school students from 3 under-resourced districts across the city. At the program's first event, a group of 16 students toured the office, and one of them asked her, not knowing who she was, why a tech company would bother setting something like this up at all. Caroline told him only that someone had once taught her the hard way, that people deserve a chance before they've proven anything, and left it at that. The boy nodded like it was a reasonable answer and went back to asking the engineer beside him about coding. She answered every question the new leadership team asked her about the mistakes made under her watch, even when the questions were uncomfortable, even when nobody was required to make her answer them. In one of those sessions, a young human resources coordinator asked her directly whether she thought she would have done things differently if the man in the lobby that day had been dressed like an executive. Caroline did not deflect the question. She said no, she would not have thrown him out. And that was exactly the problem, because it meant her judgment had never really been about the shirt at all. It had been about who she assumed belonged in rooms like that one and who she assumed did not. For the first time in her career, nobody was measuring her by what she said in a boardroom. The board had moved on. The press had moved on to newer scandals, and the only person still paying close attention to what Caroline did was Caroline herself. She began to understand something Grant had told her in that Boston office, a sentence that had stayed with her longer than any other part of the conversation. Reflexes tell the truth about a person faster than any rehearsed speech. She had spent months trying to build new reflexes, and there was no shortcut for that kind of work, no press conference that could finish it for her, no single gesture large enough to undo the 4 seconds it had taken to make the original mistake. Jonathan Pierce was named permanent chief executive of Whitmore Systems 5 months after Caroline's departure. The board remembered what almost no one else had noticed that morning in the hotel lounge, that he was the only person in the room who had stood up, shaken Grant's hand, and offered him coffee before anyone knew his name. Jonathan had grown up watching his own father, a man who ran a small hardware store for 30 years, get underestimated by suppliers and buyers who assumed a small store owner had nothing worth listening to. He had never talked about it much at Whitmore Systems, But it was the reason he had stood up that morning without thinking twice. And it was the reason he built his entire tenure as chief executive around a single idea. In his first address to the company, standing in front of employees who had spent the last 5 months watching their company nearly collapse, Jonathan did not mention Caroline directly. He said only that Whitmore systems would be judged from now on by a simple standard. How a person is treated when they have nothing to offer says more about a company than how they are treated when they do, and that standard would apply in every meeting with every client starting that day. One engineer who had quietly updated her resume during the worst weeks of the crisis later said the only reason she stayed was that final address and the fact that Jonathan kept repeating the same standard in every meeting afterward instead of letting it fade into a slogan on a wall. She had been ready to leave the moment a better offer came through. 6 months later, she was training new hires on the same standard herself, telling them the story of the hotel lobby not as gossip, but as the reason the company now did things differently. The culture shifted in ways that were hard to measure on a balance sheet, but impossible to miss inside the building. New hires went through training that Caroline herself had helped design during her final months at the company. Client meetings started including a rule that surprised no one who had heard the story. Nobody was screened out of a room based on how they looked walking through the door, regardless of title, regardless of what they were wearing. Months later, when a potential client showed up to a meeting in work boots and a stained jacket having come straight from a warehouse inspection, the junior associate greeting him remembered the rule and walked him in without hesitation. The meeting closed a contract worth more than anyone on the team had expected. Revenue recovered slowly over the following year, climbing back past where it had been before the crisis. But the recovery Grant seemed to care about most was the one nobody could put on a spreadsheet. Employee turnover, which had spiked in the months after the story broke, leveled off and then reversed. People who had quietly started looking for other jobs during the crisis stayed. A few who had left came back once word spread about what the company was becoming under Jonathan's leadership. Caroline was no longer copied on company emails, no longer invited to board meetings, no longer the person reporters called for comment. She visited the office only once during that year, dropping off materials for the mentorship program, and was surprised when 3 former colleagues stopped her in the hallway just to ask how she was doing. Nobody treated her like a stranger, and nobody treated her like the CEO she used to be either. She had become without any title to prove it. The first person at Whitmore Systems willing to say out loud that she had been wrong and to keep proving it long after anyone was still watching. Grant heard updates about her progress through mutual contacts in the industry secondhand and unprompted, and he never once reached out to check on her himself. He didn't need to. Actions he had told her once were the only apology he ever trusted, and he was content to let the months speak for themselves rather than ask her to speak for them again. 1 year to the week after the meeting that ended her career, Caroline walked back into the same hotel lobby in Midtown Manhattan. She was not there for business. Grant happened to be in New York for an unrelated meeting, and when a mutual contact mentioned it, Caroline asked for nothing more than 5 minutes in the same lounge at the same hour of the morning. She almost changed her mind twice on the walk over, certain he would say no, but she kept walking anyway, thinking of the line from her father's notebook, the one about catching himself just in time, and wondering whether she had caught herself in time or simply too late to matter. She saw Grant first seated near the same table where he had once sat holding his daughter's dinosaur backpack. This time, Caroline crossed the room without hesitation and extended her hand before he had the chance to stand. It was a small gesture, ordinary in any other context, but between the two of them it carried the weight of everything that had happened in the year since the last time they stood in that room together. Grant looked at her hand for a moment, then took it. His grip was steady, unremarkable, nothing like the moment people might have expected after everything the story had put both of them through. There were no cameras this time, no press conference, no rehearsed statement waiting to be delivered. Just 2 people who understood exactly what the handshake meant and exactly what it had cost to earn. "The mentorship program has 40 students now," Caroline told him. 3 schools. I didn't want to say anything until it had actually done something instead of just being an idea on paper. Grant nodded, and for the first time since she had known him, something in his expression eased not quite a smile, but close to one. "That's good work," he said. "Better than anything you could have said to me in that lobby a year ago." Caroline asked carefully how his daughter was doing, and Grant told her she had just started playing soccer again after a year off the same photograph from his desk, now a year out of date. It was the first time either of them had spoken about anything outside of the company, the apology, or the deal, and it landed somewhere quieter than either subject. He asked how Jonathan was running things, and Caroline told him honestly that the company felt different now, steadier in ways she had not managed to build herself even when she had every resource to try. Grant listened, said it sounded like the investment had gone where he wanted it to go, and glanced at his watch. He told her he had a flight to catch and picked up the same kind of plain leather bag he had carried the day they first met. Caroline watched him walk out through the same doors he had walked through a year earlier, this time on his own terms. She stayed behind for a moment in the lobby in the exact spot where she had once ordered a stranger removed in under 5 seconds and thought about how little that moment had cost her to perform and how much it had cost everyone else to repair. Some mistakes cannot be undone with an apology. They can only be outlived one deliberate choice at a time. For as long as it takes for the truth of a person's character to catch up with the truth of their reflexes.